This lesson is about solving equations using the distributive property. So we've learned about using the distributive property. We've also learned about solving two-step equations. Basically what's going to happen in this lesson, in order to solve these equations, the first thing we're going to be doing is using distributive property, and then we're going to be solving the equations like we did using the two-step equation method. So we're going to skip over to example 2. Example 1 was a problem we didn't really necessarily need to have distributive property in order to solve, so that's why we skipped that. Example 2, we are given a problem that has a number next to the parentheses, so we are going to be using distributive property here. Like I said, to start out with, we have a number next to the parentheses there. We are going to distribute to start off. So distributing, remember, we're multiplying the number outside the parentheses to everything inside the parentheses. So if we want to go over here, we can say we're going to be doing negative 5 times s plus negative 5 times 30. Make sure we distribute to both of those so the one doesn't feel left out here. No frowny faces. When we do that, after we distribute that, the book's going to show a slightly different look maybe from what you guys would, but we should get to a point here of having basically 5s plus negative 150 equals negative 17. Plus negative 150 is the same as minus 150 that the book has. If you want to look at this and say, well, if I've got plus negative 150, they're adding, I need to subtract. Here's the part that's a little tricky, maybe depending how we look at this. If we have plus negative 150, we say we're adding negative 150. We subtract negative 150. What happens if we subtract a negative 150? We might want to do what? Add the opposite. So subtracting a negative 150 is actually the same thing as adding a positive 150 if we add the opposite there. So adding a positive 150. At this point, we might notice when we combine those are different signs. We have more that are positive. Different signs. We're going to subtract, take the difference there, and see we have 133 more positives than negatives. So that's how they're getting to their next step here. Again, a little bit different look in your book since they're writing things sideways. And then now it's like what we did before. They're multiplying by negative 5. We can divide by negative 5 to get our answer. And again, when you divide, that doesn't come out evenly. So it's negative 26 3/5. If you did that as a decimal, would be negative 26 6/10 would work also. Either one of those would be okay. So kind of the one thing, rather than distributing, the only real difference you might see on this problem is in the step about that we had a plus negative 150 there. And again, if you want to, like the book's doing, adding a negative 150 is actually the same thing as subtracting 150. So you can either rewrite it to where it's subtracting 150, or if you do it this way, adding negative 150 means we got to subtract a negative 150 and then add the opposite, and you'll end up doing the same thing that they're doing in the book here. Example 3. The cheerleading squad received 1/4 of the total sales of foam fingers and pom-poms at a pep rally. The squad received a total of $136.75. What was the value of the pom-pom sales P? So you can see over in the picture there, they're giving us some information. They got $458 in sales on foam fingers. So we're just taking the information, making an equation. So it's 1/4 of their total sales. They're selling pom-poms and foam fingers. So 1/4 of that total is what we're looking for, is going to be equal to the total they received. Well, Pom-pom sales, we don't know what that is, so that's going to be our variable. That's where they put the P there. Foam finger sales, I just mentioned, they said was $258. So 1/4 times that whole thing, that whole quantity added together, equals the $136.75 that they earned. So off of that equation then, once we get that set up, if we're okay with that, is going to be distributing. So again, the book actually is showing it on this one pretty well. They showed it on the last one too. I didn't realize that. But so we're distributing. So 1/4 times P plus 1/4 times 258 equals the 136.75. 1/4 times P is just the same as 1/4 P. And then 1/4 of 258. They got 64 5/10. How would they work that out? How would we work out to find out 1/4 of 258? So to find that, two ways of doing it. One way to find 1/4 of something is dividing it by 4. So 258 divided by 4. Another way we could do that, 1/4 actually is a nice decimal, is 2500ths. You could say 2500ths or 0.25 times 258. And that would be how we could get that 64 5/10. Once we've done that, like I said, after we distributed that, now we're back where we were in the last lesson where we just have a two-step equation. So we can see there adding means we need to subtract. Again, the way we're doing it, we don't have to rewrite all this other stuff. Okay, we're ready to go here. Subtract just right underneath those is fine. And then those will cancel out. And then on the other side, you subtract, you get $72.25. And then two different ways to finish this off. One way the book's doing is they're saying that, that'll work, I guess. They're saying that we could multiply, if it's 1/4 of P, if we multiply that by 4, that'll give us 1P. Another way you could do this, you could say they're multiplying it by 1/4 means we could divide. So we divide by 1/4. Again, if you wanted to, you could change the 1/4 to a decimal as a 0.25 there. And that is probably be to our advantage in this case. Just change that to a decimal. If it wasn't a decimal, remember dividing fractions, you need to keep change reciprocal. And then when you work that out, you should get the $289, just like the book did doing it their way. On this problem, a little bit different setup you could have done as well that would not have required using distributive property is you could have actually just said, well, it's 1/4 of each thing. So we could have actually gone right to the step after we distributed. We could have said 1/4 of the pom-pom sales, so 1/4 times P, plus 1/4 of the foam finger sales, so 1/4 times 258. We could have gone straight there, equals 136.75. So some of these, they're showing us, you know, this is my equation, I've got to distribute. Sometimes you can set it up differently to where you actually don't even need to distribute. There may be some problems if you look at the bottom of the page here, the try it. These are already equations set up for us to distribute, so we don't really have much say in that. If it's already set up, we've got to pretty much use distributive property in order to solve those. So if we look at the try it part A, it says use the distributive property to solve. By the way, normally when we're given a problem like this, it is not going to say, hey, you're going to use the distributive property on this problem, just so you know. The directions generally would just be solve the equation or solve, okay? They're not going to be specific as to what steps you need to do. But if we see a number next to the parentheses, we should be familiar with that idea that we are going to need to distribute. One thing before we distribute here, if we want to, we could do what? Add the opposite. Good. Inside the parentheses, they're subtracting, so if you want to add the opposite there, you can. may make things a little easier for us to see. Alright, so we're going to distribute, so we'll do negative 1/2 times b plus negative 1/2 times negative 6. Make sure you distribute to both of those. The 5 is on the other side of the equation, so it does not get distributed to here. Alright, so we'll have a negative 1/2 times b. The next part, we multiply negative 1/2 times negative 6. Negative times negative is positive, and basically we're taking half of this then. You know, negative times negative is positive. If we do half of 6, it would be 3. Okay. And again, if we're not sure about what's happening there, we can, you know, rewrite these. Negative 6 over 1. Negative times negative is positive, so that's be 6 over 2, and then 6 divided by 2 is 3. You'll get the same thing. If you'll notice at this point, now we have a two-step equation. So a two-step equation, first thing we need to do would be?
Divide.
Okay. First thing would be to subtract 3. They're adding 3. We're going to subtract 3. And then one last step, we can see they're multiplying here is generally how we probably think about this. They're multiplying by negative 1/2. We divide by negative 1/2. Occasionally I see people, instead of just dividing by negative 1/2, they divide by negative 1/2 b in this case. Remember, the b we want to keep there, just the negative 1/2 we want to get rid of. Alright, when we do that, if we were not using a calculator here, we'd want to work it out like this. Keep change reciprocal. The negative sign can go either spot when you do that. And so that would end up being negative 4. If you had a calculator option, you could just do 2 divided by negative 5/10, and then that would actually give you that answer as well. So continuing on, part B, similar idea. We see a number next to a set of parentheses here, means first thing we need to do is distribute. Good. So we're going to distribute here. So 4/10 times the x. They're subtracting, so if you want to add the opposite here first, you can. Four-tenths times x would just be 4/10 x, and then if we multiply 4/10 times negative 45/100 is negative 18/100. So that gets us to a two-step equation like we had in the previous lesson. One thing a little different here, we're still doing opposite operation, but this part might look a little different than some of the parts of what we did on the last lesson. So we can see, besides the 4/10 x, what's happening over there. Besides the 4/10 x, they're adding, so we can subtract. Now when you subtract, though, if you put it this way, you'd be subtracting a negative 18/100. And subtracting a negative, remember, we can add the opposite. Okay? If you never added the opposite at the beginning, you would just have a minus 18/100 there, and you wouldn't have this part to work with. So that's your choice, however you want to do that. But again, basically we've got a negative 18/100 plus 18/100 cancels out, is what's happening there. Okay, so those will cancel. Again, on the right side, add the opposite. So now both of those are positive. They're working together. We can add a 0 there if we'd like. So add those together would be 9 and 38 hundredths. And then our last step, we would need to divide. They're multiplying, so we divide by 4/10. When you do this, what's going to happen, we're actually dividing by a number less than 1, so our number is actually going to get bigger when we do this. Good. 23 and 45 hundredths would be our answer. And again, any of these problems, like we did in the last section, anytime you have an equation, you can substitute that back into your original equation to see if you get the right answer or not. So this one back in the original, 23 and 45 hundredths minus 45 hundredths would be 23, and then 4/10 times 23, you'd end up getting 9 and 2/10. So we could confirm that we got the right answer for that problem. In part C, we got a similar idea happening here. Again, they're subtracting, so if you want to start, you can add the opposite. So we can go ahead and distribute then. So we'll do -4 times P plus -4 times -212. When we do this, we're going to have a negative times a negative, which would be positive. We'll do 4 times 212 is okay. And now we're trying to get that variable with that variable term by itself. So we can see besides that they are adding, means we need to subtract this time. Okay, when we go to subtract that, again, subtracting, you can add the opposite there. And are those working together against each other? Against each other. So we're basically subtracting. We have more that are negative by 804. Good. Okay. And technically, again, we won't always have calculators. If you had a calculator for that problem, if you did 44 minus 848, it would tell you -804. I'm just trying to keep us thinking about that process so that if we don't have a calculator, we can still have our brains working for what we need to do there. Okay, and then the last step, we need to divide by -4. Okay, -4 divided by -4 is 1, and those then cancel out basically. 1p is the same as p. And then when you do this, negative divided by negative is positive, and 804 divided by 4, 201. Very good. So answer would be P equals 201. Page 268, the key concept, just kind of recaps what we've been talking about. If we have an equation like this, we'll distribute first. The book's not showing all their steps here, but distributing first, and then we got a two-step equation. It's always going to be there adding or subtracting, and we do the opposite, and then it's always going to be there multiplying or dividing, and we do the opposite. So look at the do you know how number 4. A family of 7 bought tickets to the circus. Each family member also bought a souvenir that costs $6. Total amount spent was $147. How much did one ticket cost? So one option for doing an equation here, we have 7 people. They bought each of them bought a ticket and a souvenir that was $6. So tickets, we would maybe define a variable here, let T represent the cost of one ticket, would be a good idea. So each person is spending a T for their ticket plus a $6. And then that total is 147. If we do it that way, we would start out by distributing and then work from there. Another option is we have 7 people buying tickets, so we could say 7 times T, and then we have 7 people buying souvenirs, that would be 7 times 6. And if you'll notice what happens here, if we look at that first equation, if you distribute from that first equation, you will get exactly what we have in the second equation. Okay? So whichever one seems better, seems easier for you to come up with for the equation is fine. So when we do that, so we got 7t, and then 7 times 6 is 42. Good. And then the next thing we need to subtract. Good. Give us some room here. So we subtract 42, which is 105, and then divide by 7, which is, okay, so $15 for one ticket. And always check on problems like this. Make sure what the directions say. Remember, we did a lesson earlier on where it just said write an equation. We didn't actually have to solve it. This one, it does say how much did one ticket cost. We are solving the equations, but double check that before you go through all of that work. One other option you guys have with this problem is that you can think about a different way of looking at what's our souvenir costs, subtracting that, and then figuring out what your ticket cost is. Depending on the problem, you may have to write an equation though. So for example, if we did 7 times 6, that would be our souvenir costs, and then we would be subtracting that from 147, and then we get that answer. It would be our cost of our tickets, and then we divide that by 7. So this would actually be another way we could come up with that. Again, that would be an equation I've written there. If it doesn't say, like this one doesn't say we have to write an equation, you could just work all those steps out. Just make sure you number your steps when you do that so we can see exactly what it is that you did in what order. Caden? So if we look at number 6, which of the following shows the correct use of the distributive property when solving this equation? So that would end up being answer choice D. They didn't add the opposite. If you want to do that, you can anytime on the subtractions here and just kind of double check what's happening. We do 1/3 times 33, so A doesn't really look like it's going to work. And then you could say plus 1/3 times negative x, and again, boils down to that's the only thing that's going to work here. The problem with B, if anybody looked at B, the problem is they distributed over to the right side of the equation, which should not be happening. And the problem with C is they're just adding. They didn't take into account the subtraction or the negative that we had on that problem. So if we look over our workbook, page 66, number 8, they have an equation that has been incorrectly solved. And the question is, what error was made? So we can see the number next to the parentheses. We are going to be distributing. Before we get going, if you want to here, you can add the opposite. Okay, again, there's nothing says we have to do that, but that might benefit. I've seen some mistakes made by not doing that. So let's look maybe off to the side here. Let's kind of work out what we'd be doing. So we'd be doing negative 4 times 6 plus negative 4 times negative b. So negative 4 times 6 would be negative 24, okay? And then negative 4 times negative b, negative times negative would be positive 4b. Do we have a mistake yet? There it is. And likely the mistake, this is what I see a lot of times, people that don't add the opposite, I see them make a sign error like that because they don't see both the negative and the subtraction sign. They don't get the sign correct by not doing that. Again, you don't have to add the opposite, but that might help you. Okay? And then part B asks what is the correct solution, so we can just continue solving this. One thing a little different on this problem is if we think about this, this is a negative 24 here. Most of the time we're thinking about let's do the opposite operation. In this case, you could say we're adding, I guess it's kind of like we did before, just a little different order. They're adding negative 24, you could say, so we could subtract negative 24 would be one way of looking at it. Okay, or you could think about, well, we've got negative 24, we need a positive 24 to cancel it out, which is what's going to happen after you add the opposite here. So we do that, we've got 4 plus 24 would be 28, and then we need to divide. 28 divided by 4, which is 7. So the answer should have actually been 7 instead of negative 7. Number 10, we've got the ticket price for a concert includes $6.40 for the concert, $4.80 for the program, and a hall restoration fee. The price for 11 tickets is $128.15. Write an equation to represent the cost of the hall restoration fee F. So a couple different ways we could do this problem. One way we could do this, we have 11 tickets. Each of those tickets is going to have the 640, the 480, and that restoration fee. And that's going to be $128.15 altogether. We would be distributing then to solve this. The next step would be a different way you could have written your equation to start with. We have 11 640s, we have 11 480s, and we have 11 restoration fees. So if we multiply these, it would be $70.40. 70.4, we could add a 0 since we're talking about money. The 11 times 480 would be $52.80. And then a little different than some of the problems we've seen, we can actually combine these costs together. Those are like terms. So if you add those together, is 123.2, so $123.20. And then they're adding, so we can subtract. Is $4.95. And then we divide would be 45 cents. Okay, 0.45, so 45 cents. So not too bad for our hall restoration fee that we're being charged here. So what I'd like you to do is page 269, 7 through 10, and 12 through 17. For 7 through 10, there are boxes there. You do not need to use the boxes. And so if that's any of these, again, as always, if there's not enough room, do it on scrap paper or in your notebook preferably.